I mean, I've been doing it for over 20 years, so.
So your organization is Sea Grant?
Yes, I'm in a co-funded position.
Yeah.
And we'll.
Yeah.
She and I worked on that for a while.
Okay. We're good. Greetings, everybody. Hello to all of you that are here tonight, and those of you who are watching us online. I know some of you are as far away as east as Cape Cod and as far south as Texas. So, hello to all of you out there. And those of you who will be watching this when it's online later on, if you couldn't make it today. The Londonderry Conservation Commission is very happy to present this program tonight. I'm Erwin Kuchenberg, Chair of the Commission, and this is the first of a three-part series that we're going to be offering this winter, and the first of an annual winter three-part series. Tonight we're going to be talking about rivers. Next month we're going to be talking about the last 260 years in Vermont, and then in April we have a talk on wetlands and beavers and what we're doing for our landscape. So you'll be hearing more about that. So tonight, rivers rivers created growth and prosperity, but sometimes it bites us back. So there are all kinds of reasons why that's happened, some of them man-made, and our speakers are going to talk about all of that tonight. And I know that this is a topic of because of the problems we've had with flooding, so that's going to be addressed also. So I'm happy to introduce our speakers. Shane Jackwith is Flood Restoration Manager with the Nature Conservancy, and he has spoken for us before, 2 or 3.
Must have been right before COVID.
Yeah, yeah. So he led us on a lovely walk down by Riverside and showed us using the river as an actual teaching tool of what happens with rivers. And tonight he's going to expand on that, go back and expand on that. And he's accompanied by boys who's with Sea Grant and also with the Nature Conservancy. So take it away.
Yeah, thanks.
And we'll have a Q&A afterwards for those of you who have questions and want to speak some more to us.
Thanks, Erwin. Yeah, it's good to be back. Get together we had, I guess that was 2019. I thought it was a great conversation. We had a good crowd. Yeah, we had a good conversation around river management in the state. So again, Shane Jackwith with the Nature Conservancy. I know the Nature Conservancy, the folks in our chapter know well. You know, we are a global conservation organization with a chapter in every state, and then I'd say approximately 20 chapters around the world outside of the U.S. Natural areas throughout Vermont, and we've helped conserve a whole bunch. A lot of that has been turned over to the state over the years, but you know, that's basically what we do. Our mission globally is to conserve the land and waters on which all life depends. So that's a little bit about the Nature Conservancy. We were to strike a partnership with the Lake Champlain Sea Grant program and help fund flood resilience educator position. We started into this work a little over a year ago. And through that partnership with the Sea Grant program, we were able to create for both TNC and Sea Grant program. And I'll let.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Noyes, and like Shane said, I'm the flood resilience educator with Lake Champlain Sea Grant and the Nature Conservancy. Lake Champlain Sea Grant of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, and the Lake Champlain Sea Grant program is based information that will help benefit and the environment in our regional area. So again, thank you guys so much for coming out. We will be focusing today on actions and how they can help us reduce our exposure to flood hazards. So just to give everyone an outline of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to start with a brief overview of Vermont flood history, and then we're going to explore the different factors that make flooding in Vermont so damaging. And then Shane is going to discuss how we can help to reduce our exposure to flood hazards through floodplain management, and more specifically at the end. But before we jump in, does anyone have any questions now? Okay. So as you all may know, Vermont has a long history of large-scale floods. These 5 floods are 5 largest floods in the past 150 years or so, starting in 1869 with the All New England flood. That was around the time when National Weather Service started collecting that data, followed by the Great Vermont Flood in 1927, the Great New England Hurricane in 1938, 73, and then of course Tropical Storm Irene in 2011. And as we all know, we did experience severe flooding this past year. National Weather Service is still cataloging that data, so that's why that's not included here. In addition to floods, Vermont actually floods on smaller regional scales pretty frequently, and that's what we're trying to illustrate with this diagram. From the years 1970 to 2011, we have in these different colored circles the areas of the highest concentrated damage from these regional floods. So I guess the biggest takeaway from this image is that while we do have these large-scale floods that the media covers, there are also frequent flooding events on smaller scales that floods frequently. And the main we experience, or the hazards that we experience from flooding, kind of fall into 2 main categories, which we will talk about later. But the first is inundation flooding, which is shown by this image of Montpelier in the top left. Inundation flooding happens when water rises and areas that aren't normally wet become wet. And the second type of hazard is erosion, or about riverine flooding. And that basically means that fast-moving water will strip away sediment from stream banks, which can be really damaging, especially if there is infrastructure or buildings kind of right on the edge of that stream bank. And as you can see here, sometimes structures can get carried away and roads can get undercut. And 80% of the damage that Vermont experiences from flooding is from erosion. So what are the factors that make our floods so damaging here in Vermont? We're going to 3 factors, which are our topography, our precipitation patterns, and then our history of. So Vermont is a very mountainous state. We have lots of steep and narrow river valleys, which results in a lot of steep. And because of this, we often choose to develop in these narrow river valleys and these flat areas right next to our rivers. So Vermont is considered to have a wet climate. We kind of are dealing with water moving through our system all the time, but that is predicted to increase. Our area is predicted to become wetter going forward, and so that just means precipitation events, and they will be more intense. And of course, these precipitation events are what fuel the flooding. So when that water hits our mountainous topography, that's kind of what exacerbates the flooding. And then our third factor here is risky development. So going back to what we were talking about with the topography, that has kind of rivers because we have so many mountainous hills, and from a construction standpoint, it's easier to develop on a flatter area. But oftentimes these flatter areas around the river are also the most flood prone areas. This red zone here is showing a high flood hazard area. So historically, we've done a lot of work to try to protect our developments in these risky areas that have resulted in a lot of unintended consequences or danger. So we've kind of taken this control approach to the rivers, basically, or the river in the spot that it was when we developed next to it. So rivers are dynamic beings. They kind of are they change where they are all the time, and they tend to take on this meander. But historically, to accommodate either agriculture, development, or roads, we have tried to, which you can see here in these two examples, kind of the contrast between the shapes of the rivers on the left and then what it looks like now, straightened here on the right, both in White River, and this is the Huntington River in Huntington, Shane's hometown. We have the Black Creek. And we straighten the channel. This actually accelerates this. To use the analogy of skiing, so when you're skiing down a slope, to slow yourself down, you'll take wide turns. Now imagine you're skiing that same slope, but you're just going straight. It's the same kind of idea with the rivers. When they're meandering, they have lots of opportunities. They access water, and when we straighten our channels, they are faster and have more destructive, erosive force, which is more dangerous to buildings, infrastructure, people that can be close to them. And this diagram is just illustrating the slope. When a river is straightened, the slope is increased, making it more destructive. Practice that we have adopted historically, trying as a means to try to mitigate our flooding is dredging, so digging out rivers. And so this example is just showing kind of beforehand when our banks are low and low velocity. So it's kind of, everything is pretty shallow, the banks are wide. Force that's able to flow through something that is able to expand out into what is considered to be the floodplain here. But when we dig out or dredge our rivers, the rivers become a lot deeper and they have a lot more force. So again, we're speeding up the power in the river. And this is kind of an interesting concept of treated area of the river, but the results of dredging, digging out a river, can affect the whole river system. After an area is dredged, a process called head cutting will begin, which actually starts to move upstream, which is kind of counterintuitive, because usually when I think about river impacts, I'm like, oh, what's happening downstream? But this about it, how a waterfall would fall down. It begins to undercut and move backwards over time, which moves essentially up the river. So these management techniques that we take in certain each than just the area where something was dug out. So in conclusion to this first part of the presentation, our historic land use and channel management activities have resulted in an extensive channel instability. So what's happening in a lot of our streams and rivers in Vermont is that they are on this kind of 5-stage channel evolution, where the river begins to insize and the channel becomes deeper. the banks become unstable and on the side will fall in, and then the channel gets widened, it begins again. But this is a very unstable process for rivers to be going through. DEC has assessed over 5,000 river miles in Vermont, and 75% are undergoing this channel evolution phase. A big problem. A lot of our rivers in Vermont do not look like or behave like they did before we all came to develop them. So while we can't go back in time and change the decisions that were made in the past, we do have control going forward to make smarter decisions about where we're choosing to develop, and also giving our rivers the room they need to slow down. But there are a lot of become more flood resilient through floodplain regulations, which Shane is going to talk about now.
Yeah, thanks. All right. So that little explanation of river dynamics and our channel management development pattern, as Sarah said, what we can do moving forward, right? So just to summarize that section of the presentation, we're in a situation in which the combination of our steep mountain topography, narrow valleys, little place to develop, little risky developments, vulnerable developments, right along the side of rivers that are highly unstable because of this history of channel management, this approach that we've taken of trying to control the river to protect our investment. Three factors, all magnified by the fact that our precipitation patterns or precipitation events are becoming more intense, right, and predicted to do so immensely. Those factors are all combining to create immense and ever-increasing flood hazards, flood damage, right? Our neighbors, our communities are all feeling the impacts, and the costs are ever increasing. So the question, as Sarah kind of put it, is like, what do we do going forward? Find ourselves in, because we can't go back. So historically, Vermont and the U.S. overall has relied on agency National Flood Insurance Program and at the NFIP program, right? And I think a lot of you are probably somewhat familiar, have heard of the National Flood Insurance Program, but for those of you that need a refresher, have never. In a nutshell here, basically what happens is FEMA creates maps that show where floods exist, right? All of our communities, our communities have flood hazard maps created by FEMA. If a town chooses to participate, the town adopts regulations that restricts how development happens in those flood hazard areas. And they regulate based upon a minimum standard established by FEMA. FEMA will provide flood insurance to all of the residents and businesses in that municipality. Now let me back up. I should have said this at the beginning of this slide. The National Flood Insurance Program was created in 1968 in response to the fact away from providing flood insurance because they were just losing their shirts on flood insurance. So the federal government stepped in to create this federally backed program for individuals that live in flood hazard areas. It's just an insurance program, and it's just based on inundation versus the erosion. And as Sarah just mentioned, the erosion hazard is responsible for Vermont's flood damage expenses, not buildings getting wet, but roads and buildings getting undercut by the moving river and falling into the drink, right? So there's some deficiencies here with the National Flood Insurance Program. additionally, or another deficiency, is the fact that because we largely rural state with low population densities, relatively speaking, FEMA the flood hazard areas around all of our rivers. So many communities are, in fact, only somewhere about 12% of rivers have maps with flood hazard data, and I'm not approximately 5 to 6% have maps that actually show, which is I won't get into that, but the point being, a lot of communities around the state just don't have maps. A lot of homeowners don't know the hazard area. A lot of home buyers don't know that they're about to buy a house that's in a flood hazard area, and they might want to look into the cost of flood insurance, right? We're largely moving forward an understanding. Another issue is that even where flood maps orange corridor here, and there's a yellow corridor here. The yellow corridor represents the FEMA flood insurance hazard area, the area that FEMA predicts could get wet during a large flood event. Like many areas across the state, that polygon only includes, again, the inundation area. So it doesn't well above the river and will never get wet from a flood. That house is not in the FEMA flood map. But boy, is it susceptible to flood erosion damage. That is not even considered in the FEMA hazard maps. So that house did not have to get, that homeowner did not have to get flood insurance. And that's a big missing piece. And again, just to say, National Flood Insurance Program doesn't consider erosion hazards, just the hazards associated getting wet. Everything gets wet, the water goes down, you got to deal, you got to rip out all the drywall for 4 feet up off the floor and deal with everything else, right? That's what it looks at. It does not protect against this sort of hazard. So we have pretty good participation. I think there's only 20 communities shown in pink here throughout the state that don't participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. Looks to me like Londonderry does. So you all can buy flood insurance, whether you lived in the flood hazard area or not. I don't know why you would if you didn't live in the flood hazard area, but you can. And so this leaves us feeling like pretty good, right? We're in the program, but because of the deficiencies I mentioned earlier, we're not really protected the way that we need to be. What do we need to do moving forward? A lot of people who have thought about this have agreed that what we need to do is actually identify this area that is susceptible to those erosion hazards, the hazards created by the... We need to understand where that area is, map it, and limit our development, limit our exposure to risks. Every time there's a flood and we have to pay for the recovery, I'm sure we all know forward, how can we reduce that burden on the taxpayer? So that is what has been proposed by the Agency of Natural Resources for a long time, and they've actually mapped these flood hazard areas, or what they call the river corridor. They've done that throughout the state. You can go and they have been using ahead of myself. No, I'm not actually. They use these maps currently when they review development under the Act 250 process, right? Whenever the state has to get involved in Act 250, If there's an active development right here, they pull out their river corridor map and they look to see whether it's in the river corridor or not. They use activities that municipalities can't regulate, things like agriculture and forestry. Build a barn in this area, they'll pull out the river corridor map and see if the barn's in the river corridor or not, and make their recommendations based on that. They also have been assisting municipalities development in river corridors, and I'll get into that a little bit more. The state has started to take the approach, and this is the Agency of Natural Resources, of identifying these river corridors, these hazardous areas that aren't captured by the National Flood Insurance Program, put them on them to inform development decisions. Looks like the combination of the National Flood Insurance maps and the river corridor. In the red is the National Flood Insurance flood hazard area. In the yellow is the state mapped river corridor. If a town chooses to adopt river corridor, protect the river corridors, this is what their maps in their town will look like. You notice in some the river, the floodplain area is really narrow and the river corridor is a lot wider. That's kind of like the area that I showed in that other image with the house sitting perched up on that bluff. You might have a river that's down deep and the water's never going to be 25 feet high, but those banks are only made of sand and gravels. If the river decides to do so, it'll easily move through that and take it down. So that's where the river corridor is wider than the floodplain. In other areas, the floodplain is wider than the river corridor. The river is ever likely to move. Maybe there's bedrock or something along this section that will never allow the river to move way out here. But of course, rock and just and spread out if it's low enough, right? So they're different, but together they comprehensive protection that we really need. And I think that's been proven time and time again with all of the flooding we've had. So, of a pitch, we do have an interest. Municipalities choose to, they can protect their river corridors. It's a matter of adopting the zoning language in your land use regulations, your zoning bylaws, however you refer to them. By the state, the towns adopt the zoning language, and the state has developed with the National Flood Insurance Program language, and it's not that easy because the NFIP program is highly bureaucratic. So to put these two together and get them to work together without creating issues is really complicated. But so the state has spent a lot of time language so that those two regulatory approaches fit and work together, and they can. If the town chooses to adopt the river corridor protections, because the town is in essence reducing its, the state rewards that by providing the town a great cost share when there's a disaster declaration. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, known as ERAF for short, but that's the fund that the state uses during a disaster declaration to offset the local cost share that the feds don't provide. The feds typically recover from a disaster, a declared disaster. The state has long had this ERAF fund, and it kicks in, I believe, normally 12%. If the town has the road and bridge standards, which I think Sarah learned that Londonderry does, has adopted road and bridge standards, then the state ups their to like 15%. And then if the town adopts the river corridor protections on top of that, the state ups their share to 17.5%, I believe it is. So the cost to the town to recover from flood damage is town has taken steps to reduce Vermont's overall, because it's financially beneficial to the state and the taxpayers of the state. So that option is there for municipalities. Sarah and I, as part of what we're doing together, we are more than happy, would be more than happy to talk in more detail with the Planning Commission, the Select Board, the DRB, whoever it might be. If there are people that are thinking, yeah, this might be a good idea for Londonderry, let's learn some more about it. We're happy to help. And we can't answer all your questions, but we can probably answer a lot of your questions and then put you in contact with the right people to answer the rest of your questions. So the state has been working to get towns going back to 2008. And what we have is about a 10% of the towns in the state adopting. It's really only the yellow towns that have adopted, and again, the color choice, I don't know, for me, it's not showing up very distinctly, but there's river corridor protections. The orange towns have adopted some sort of interim protection, but they don't typically and adopt the full corridor protection. So let's say 10% of the municipalities have gone through and adopted corridor protection since about 2008. So we're not doing very good. And what we hear over and over again is that, and I understand it because I was on my town's planning commission and I know the zoning administrator and I know the town administrator. What we hear is that it's a great idea, but boy, are we already burdened with doing everything we do, and our zoning administrator is already, completely overworked trying to do what they do. The zoning already is really difficult and complex. We're not sure we want to add this layer on top of that. We hear that over and over again. That's not really showing up the way it's supposed to. And another number of other organizations, I'll go back to that. A number of other organizations have been promoting statewide adoptions of river corridor protections or limitation of development in river corridors, where the state floodplain management program would administer the whole thing. They have the maps, they would be the police, and they would do the. Last year there was a bill introduced into the House. I think it was H29. It got kicked around quite a bit, looked promising for a while, and it the river corridor protections. Ultimately, it died, I think, this year. Probably not surprising after July and August, that idea was reintroduced, and it's now Senate. It's billed. It's not 219. It's 213. That's my error. It's S213. It's in the Senate, and after July and August, it is getting serious consideration. I heard today that it went through a markup. Those markup sessions are where proposed legislation can really get hammered, modified. So, Senate Bill 213 is a revision of the flood hazard area and the river corridor rule. This is kind of jargony, but basically to incorporate statewide jurisdiction and recommended by the Vermont Clean Action Plan, or climate plan, and it establishes the process to map appropriate and fill. That's basically it's for the state to take it over, right? That's the idea. The towns are overburdened. If we really think this is important, let's pass it at the state level. So, again, we and others are moving along. Whether it gets across the governor's desk, I think, is. And, Governor Scott has his reasons. At the same time, he has stood up after the floods of this summer, and he has said that we need to deal with the issue. So I think he's, he recognizes the issue and the importance of it, but he also has his principles, right? And things that he thinks are important. So what happens in the end, hard to say, but it's really getting a lot of support in the PNC just did, I think these results came out last week, maybe the week before, just did some polling on this idea of support for this idea of introducing statewide, state-administered floodplain management, river corridor protection. And with like, I don't know, 25 different questions and all the stats on the responses to all the questions, that would really put everybody to sleep pretty quick. So if I had to pick one, I think this is the result that tells the story. And that is that there is bipartisan support. 67% of the 500 supported, 67%, it was bipartisan polling. It breaks out to 80% support by Democrats and 57% support by independents and 57% support by Republicans. The pollers said they'd never see proposed legislation. This is very strong support. So as one of the organizations advocating for this, we were happy to see that. But so that seems to be where the public will is right now for this idea. And that is the conclusion of the presentation. I just threw this in there. I think I had it on another slide too, but it's a really nice graphic, I think, that conveys the idea. This is on the Flood Ready website, or that website that was created after Irene in 2012. It's still there, the website. One of the nice things that came out, this is a nice graphic that came out of it, but the idea being that, you know, we have these blue river corridor, this erosion hazard area, that really are safe and appropriate for development. And let's do our dense development in those areas. And where things aren't safe, let's keep those in where we're not making big, really big investments that are risky. And let's maintain a resilient landscape where there's space for dynamic natural processes. And as a result, I will add that, and I didn't have this in the slide, I'm just realizing it now, this is a village right on the river with people that live right on this river. And there's probably plans for continued, right, a lot of villages. This whole idea of protecting river corridors respects that we have village areas, corridors, and we will respect the idea that we need to continue to develop in those areas. And towns have wanted to do that. And we will armor, we will channelize, we will do whatever we have to do to protect the development in those areas, as long as at the more risk. Because if we leave these areas to absorb all this erosion energy and allow this water to rise up on these floodplains, we greatly reduce the risk, the energy to these downstream villages. So we can balance those two, and we can respect those for doing otherwise. So that's all baked in the presentation on management, flood risk, and how we might work to mitigate all of those risks and hazards, and having a free-form conversation. So happy to take. Are you thinking there's a connection there that we ought to be Are you thinking there's a connection there that we ought to be thinking about, or like we know? Whether you adopt a river corridor protection or not, I don't think that influences. Not apparent to me, not intentionally. Maybe unintentionally there's implications there, but if you can think of.
It then runs down the main street of the village.
So it's hazard. The water's coming up and spreading out,
Right.
and yes, and so that is an issue. But
but at the same time, is the dam slowing down the flow of the water so that
Yeah.
maybe it's
Yeah.
providing a benefit there?
Yeah, and but in some cases, that is also controlling the grade of the river, right? Like that slide that Sarah showed where this channel evolution process occurs. It was her last. Like, the problem we get into, the way we got into this, well, one of the ways we got into this problem is where when we settled this houses and made other investments in these beautiful, flat, well-drained areas, right? Wow, you can't get better area for development, right? Like, especially in this state. But then, you know, after a few years, so then, you know, we put the berms in, and the berms disconnected the river from the energy dissipation device in this whole system, that floodplain, right? The water spreads out, it gets slow, right? Well, when you build the berms to keep the water in that channel, all that energy goes to work on the bed, and that channel goes straight down, and then you get into this widening situation, and then the houses start coming, right? So having the river, the bed of the river up high, close to the floodplain is actually good, and that flooding, our flooding problem, we've traded our flooding problem, our inundation problem, for an erosion problem. Right? We got rid of the flooding by putting in the berms, but then we got the erosion, right? So it's a double-edged sword, balancing the pros and cons. So the dam's getting everybody wet upstream, but at the same time, the dam, so that the water can spread out and slow down, and the energy can be dissipated. So there's a little bit of a tension there. Yeah. What do we do with that scenario?
Have you walked our corridor and really looked at, we have an interesting dynamic. The Utley Brook feeds into the West River, and so at that convergence you actually get water pushing upstream and then spreading out.
Yeah.
So some of the flooding that occurs is from the actual back push of the Utley Brook.
Yeah.
Corridor study is actually happening and in our area, and it will be available to us in September. It'll be great information. But how frequently do you see?
So a lot of these maps are created using hydraulic models, right? Modeling, you know, they take the shape of the river, they put it in the computer, they put the slope of the river in the computer, they put some other factors in there, then they run different volumes of water through that model in the computer, and they see how high the water gets, and then they see the lines, and there's your flood map. Where you have the convergence of two rivers, you know, those two flows of water, like you said, particularly where one's bigger, smaller stream, and that water backs up, and they're difficult areas to predict what's going to happen. So that is a challenge for that inundation hazard that Sarah talked about, where the water comes up and spreads out, right? So going to look like the FEMA. Maybe when you say the corridor study, you're talking about the new flood maps that you're supposed to get, right? I believe that's.
We had a flood mitigation meeting on Monday, and the Agency of Natural West River, it's supposed to be completed in April, and it's the West sections.
Yeah, so they're doing a river corridor plan. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so that'll be really informative. I have not seen that. I'm not aware of it, but that'll be really informative to you. But is there something else you want me to say?
No, I mean, I didn't know how often the convergences actually.
Yes, that's a common, very common scenario, and they create a lot of problems. I can think of like the town of Johnson. The brook that comes off of Madonna, Smuggler's Notch area, comes down into the mess. That convergence, that confluence there, it's a huge, the whole village gets inundated, and it's because of that same issue. Yeah. So it's really good you guys are working, and you're going to learn a lot. And
Related to that, if you've seen, normally you can't really touch the path of the river, but in that situation where there's a backup or something, have you seen where towns can alter the mediate that?
Yeah, I don't know that. I mean, you could dredge that out, lower the bed of the river, right? So you have more capacity. And that's what we've historically done, right? That's what Sarah talked about with our historic command and control approach. Keep the water in the channel. But you get that head cutting process that Sarah described. That's the job of the Agency of Natural Resources River Management Engineer, to come into that specific site, look at it, and say, the amount of sediment that comes down. If there's a tremendous amount of sediment coming down that brook, that person, because we'll get more gravel to come down and replace what we took out. It's not like we're going to get a head cutting scenario. So it's a case-by-case basis, and that's the river management engineer's job. And I think they do a good job. Right? They're trying to balance these erosion hazards. At the same time, they know that doing things like dredging are likely, many cases, going to cause more issues, but they recognize that not doing anything might mean that the way adjacent is going to fall in the drink within the next couple of years or get flooded out repeatedly. So it's challenging. I think it's on a case-by-case basis.
So this is about that same confluence. I'm the select board chair, Tom Cavanaugh. And I've found a scientific study that says, because right now those two rivers come in at about a 90 degree.
Yeah.
I found a scientific angle,
Yeah.
less than that angle,
Yeah.
you can control the backwater by up to 54%.
Yeah. When
And I am trying to work with Scott Jensen.
going.
I haven't heard back from him. I sent him the study,
Okay.
and I've checked in with him a couple times, but
Yeah.
have you seen anything like that done?
I'm sure it is. I can't think of a specific instance where I've seen it done, but that doesn't. I'm not in a position of really keeping my eye on that sort of thing. I think Scott would be the better, but absolutely, you get the convergence of two fluids coming together, right? In a low angle, they're going to converge much more smoothly than, as you decrease that angle, that's not a good scenario still. You get lots of back eddies, right? You get that seam of water where as you change that convergence angle, it's going to improve it. You're absolutely, yeah. So I think it's a great idea, and that is the right thing to do.
So, we'll keep our asking.
I had a question. Is that over so many years, or I didn't understand what you're referring to?
That came from the National Climate Assessment, and how many years? Yes, right. Good question. I think Sarah, you had that right on yours, and bigger, so we can actually see it. Yeah. So what is that? Percent in 2011 in the amount of precipitation falling in very heavy events, and I think they define very heavy events as more than a certain number of inches within 24 hours, right? There's a definition, but yeah, this comes out of the from the National Climate Assessment, and so that's actually not a prediction going forward. That's just what we've seen already.
Increasing sounded like projection.
Yeah, but sort of presentations of the same idea that intensity of precipitation is just, I think, was it most recently was a study out of, I keep wanting to say Cornell, but that's in New York, of course, New Hampshire. It looked at flood costs, and over the next 100 years, costs are going to increase by The UVM did a similar sort of thing not too long ago. It's just the outlook is just really not good because, you know, the precipitation patterns are just getting so energized. Yeah.
Like, we're gonna need some kind of heavy hand or like some more statewide role in all together, because it's so clear that, you know, like this channelizing or whatever, like whatever we're doing upstream has these huge impacts downstream. I'm an upstream town from Londonderry, and like it's so clear we have to work together to try to soften what's going on,
Yeah.
and we need help and
Yeah.
need help and maybe need to be pushed to
Yeah.
work together somehow. And
Yeah.
we're not particularly good at that, but
Yeah. Is your comment? Is you?
I'm
Scott?
not.
Yeah. Go.
Weston, Jamaica, and Londonderry have formed a committee
Yeah.
to start looking at a regional approach. Keep working on it.
And I know the Wyndham Regional Commission, they're very active around flood hazard mitigation. Your regional approach that you mentioned,
They're helping us out too.
they might be helping with that. So yeah, and you know, we really have learned. I worked for the A&R Rivers program, Scott Jensen's program. I provided scientific support to the river engineers. I've worked for that program for 16 years. I helping VTrans assess damage. I did trainings for VTrans for about 3 years and municipal road crews. And we moved away from it. That, you know, all of this stuff, like it's that model where the river downcuts. I remember, and the head engineer of the program had been working in that program for probably, and we found this, and so like we were starting to expose ourselves, moving away from just strict engineering, because that's where this has always been. This has been the domain of the engineer. Rock, and how big does that rock need to be to hold the river where it is? And the holy bleep. I have seen so many rivers like that, and I have just told the crews to add more rock. And all I was doing was holding those banks up so that that river could cut down even further. That's all we were doing. And those rivers continue to cut down and cut down. And the whole failure, the width of the whole failure is just that much wider because, of course, the further down the thing goes, the further out the erosion happens once it starts going, right? We really have learned that command and control approach, it's just costing us more and more money. The states, like, we really need to get back to this. And in order to get back to this, we need to let the rivers do what they do within that corridor. Because when they move to the side, what ends up, they're moving back and forth, and they take out this high bank that they've created, and then they rebuild a new floodplain at the lower elevation. So we floodplain, rebuild that pressure relief valve in the system. And there's many urban areas that are looking at these incised, these rivers that have gone through this, and okay, this is the no-touch zone. That's the area where the river needs to move around, and we're going to give it back that area. In Vermont, we still have a lot of land that's like this, and if we can get back up to these wider areas, we can dissipate that narrower valley bottom, and your energy dissipation can't spread out as much. So we're trying to, access as much of the floodplain as we can and the river corridor as we can, but it's where we exist in this context of here and settling this landscape, in the early 1700s, and we have to work within the development patterns that we have, so we can't always reach the ideal condition, and we do what we can. So, but you're absolutely right. Like working together, what happens upstream affects downstream, and it's like the reason like we like to talk about that is because most, as Sarah said, like most people don't think about, oh, what you do downstream can actually happen. That's exactly what happens. You know, you dredge enough in one for miles upstream, you might get this head cutting happening, which leads you from here to there. It disconnects the river from the floodplain. And you might hear a lot about that, floodplain river connectivity. That's just describing this scenario where the river's really well connected to the floodplain and the water can spread out on that floodplain versus this incised scenario where the river's disconnected from the floodplain.
Is there any movement actually to go upstream, finding path for the rivers, or is that
An option?
manipulating them that way? I mean, if you go north on 100, there's a lot of open fields right along the West River.
Yeah.
And then if you go up into Landgrove, do they ever go in and actually try to slow the rivers down, or is that?
Yeah, we do. I have been involved in some of that, where you come in here and you excavate this all. That's one approach. It's expensive, right? It's super expensive. Another thing you can do is go in here and where there's room for the river to move, you start putting structure. One of the things that we've done to our rivers is removed all of the hard structure in the river. We all know trees create problems where we have nearby developments, but a river channel is not a river channel without large wood structure, just like your house isn't a house if you don't have your 2x6s in your walls, providing that structure to hold your walls together. The wood was removed from our rivers long before we got it. So, but there's a lot of effort to put wood structure. Actually, you think about it, they act like dams, and you start trapping that sediment and the bed starts to build up and up and up. But if you're going to do that, you can't stop development. So that we can do that is to protect our river corridors from more development. Once we get them protected, then we don't have any conflicts, then we can do those sorts of things that, yeah, there's going to be some river movement, but over time, we're going to reconnect to that floodplain and get that energy dissipation valve back.
Is there any grant opportunities for what Mark was talking about, dropping the land down?
There
property that we is in the floodplain. And I've been thinking that's a good spot to drop down. We have some private properties in various places up by the rescue squad, like Mark was saying, that if you drop that down to about a foot above the river, you got a lot of flood storage.
Yeah, that might be the type of thing that's identified in the river corridor plan, one of these restoration type opportunities, but if it doesn't come up and it hasn't been identified, when you talk to whoever you're working with on the river corridor plan, you want to bring that idea up. That would be a good place to do it, because there is the phosphorus reduction money will pay for that, because when you reconnect the river to the floodplain, you're creating a place for the river to dump a tremendous amount of sediment, right? And we know all that sediment has phosphorus bound to it. That's one of the primary approaches that we are supporting. Connection so that the river can rise up and dump sediment onto the floodplain instead of transporting them all the way down to the lake.
Yeah, that was mentioned to me. We could do that at a joint town meeting the other day.
Yeah.
Western Jamaica and London.
Yeah.
I think I know the answer, but is there anything being done to address basically supplanting all the vegetative control of erosion?
Yeah. Sarah may or may not know more about that than I do. I know a little bit. Have you been delving into knotweed at all? I don't know if you have. Yeah. So is there anything being done to control it? I think at the state level, the most recent effort I've seen, wildlife department, and they have like a maybe a full-time staff dedicated to dealing with invasive management, and knotweed being one of those. There's a website, they have a pretty good website that I don't think existed even like 3 or 4 years ago on invasive management control. That's coming out of the agency, and they do recently was, and it's on that website, is, and I've done a lot in my career trying to deal with knotweed, and I'm not in that role anymore, but I once was. The newest thing that I've seen that's neat, I don't know, maybe expensive, I don't know, of taking wire mesh, like, you know, 1/4 inch, 1 inch grid wire mesh, really thin, really malleable, and staking that down, and the knotweed will grow up through those mesh holes, but then as it grows and gets wider, it just girdles itself on the wire. I know, it's cool, isn't it? Right, I know, I saw that, I was like, oh, that's a cool idea. I don't know what the long-term success has been, or, you know, how it's been. I didn't delve into it too deeply, but yeah, I think it's a neat idea. So that's a Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department website.
You need a lot of mesh.
What's that?
You need a lot of mesh.
Yeah, you do, right, you need a lot of, right, so how viable is a large scale, right, and I think that's what we run into. Yeah.
We have a large portion of our river, the river in our town is already occupied with knotweed.
Yeah.
And moving downstream all the time.
Yeah, no, I know, and sometimes I feel like I'm just closing my eyes to it because it's so discouraging. Yeah, it's probably not the right thing to do. Like the ostrich putting my head in the sand, I guess. I will say, like, if we can more natural systems and the rivers can move and the waters can flood, overall we're restoring the vigor of that ecosystem, those species, those native species within that ecosystem. We fight reed canary grass on a lot of our preserves. We have a few that are and of course there's reed canary everywhere, and we fight it. And you know, we've been reading a bit, and there's a school of thought out there that, like, focus on restoring the ecosystem so that all of the native species have as much vigor. And, you know, like, I think that's a school of thought. How well it works, you know, with what species, what invasives will it work or not? But you know, let's get these again and get the soils back to the, you know, the soil moisture regime back to what they were. Get the native plants back to, you know, increase vigor and give them more of a fighting chance. I think that's a logical part of the solution. So I think this kind of helps in that with that idea.
Those wetlands back where the rivers can do their oxbows and do all those things. Do we have to think about relocation of buildings there so that we don't have to keep putting energy and resources into redoing them?
Yeah, I would go back to that very last slide. Oh, it's a bigger picture right there, yeah. Border protections doesn't remove existing conflict, for them as conflicts or constraints on the river movement. It just stops us from continuing to develop, right? And that's super important because we all hear about the housing crisis every day. We all know that people are moving to the state at ever increasing rate, and there's going to be a lot of pressure to develop wherever we can. So acknowledging that we shouldn't be developing in these places anymore is the first step. With respect to,
are we mapping public land that can be developed?
Yeah, that is the next question, right? Like, if we're not going to develop these areas, where do we develop? And I think that's a really important question. And our philosophy on that is how to get there is that, you know, as a in a democratic society, you know, a messy democratic decision-making planning processes that we all engage in. Question two, if you're not, to get to a question, if you're not forced to get to it, let's take this step, protect our river corridors, and force ourselves to have that next conversation, which is, okay, we can't develop these river corridors anymore. We're gonna put our housing, where are we gonna grow our food? You know, I kind of do this thing all the time. Why aren't we developing up there? Why are we growing food down here? You know, I love agriculture. I have friends that are in agriculture. Huntington's an agricultural, my hometown's Huntington. We have a lot of agriculture in Huntington. And, you know, why is my friend who's always fighting the river, you know, why can't we get him that land up there? By taking this step. We do work with FEMA a lot to buy out homes that are flood damaged. You've probably heard the reports, you know, on the news since July of different efforts to help buy people out. And I think that's critically important. I think people must go under tremendous amounts of stress. Like, I can't imagine. I worked with a farm once to do a floodplain, we call them a floodplain cut project, where we come in and excavate the floodplain down. Farmers up in Fairfield, farm family, they were so frustrated and had been frustrated. My supervisor had known this, and they had been continuously calling him, you know, the river, we want to armor the river, we want to straighten the river. You know, like every year, we're losing our barn. We're losing our cattle path, you know, we're losing the cow pathway. And finally we really engaged them, and we explained the solution model. We sat down at their kitchen table. I must have met with them like 10 to 15 times. We were great friends by the time we had all of our conversations. And they finally agreed, okay, we'll let you come in and cut the floodplain down. We'll give up a little bit of our margin here. It's pretty marginal anyway. Do your floodplain cut thing, let the river move side. Getting close, we rocked it. You know, we put riprap on there and prevented it from going any further. I called her and I said, Caroline, I haven't been up, I haven't visited, just wondering how the river's doing. From dealing and fighting that river, my boss, my initial boss grew up in Danville on a farm. And he told me, he said, you're gonna.
So I understand the concept that have already taken place, but how can we allow the river to do its thing when we have state highway?
The corridor often ends at, well, the river corridor typically, I'll expose my lack of mathematical prowess. So if the river's 50 feet wide, we'll tack that other 150 feet on that side. Because the idea is that the river needs this width, and this comes from research. We're trying to stabilize the hydrologic regime. The slope of the river is decreasing, so the power is decreasing. And of course, to increase its length, it needs to that have gone